All right, welcome everyone to our second Transportation Tidbits virtual professional development. So nice to see everyone. I think we have over 50 participants today, so thank you for joining us. I have just a few housekeeping items before we get started. Today's presentations are being recorded and will be posted later in the week, and you can access those at any time by logging into your WASBO profile. If you have any questions, please raise your hand using the Reactions tab at the bottom of your screen. You may have to hover over it for it to show up, and WASBO staff will monitor this and will call on you when there is an opening so you can ask your question. The chat will also be monitored for questions. And then we just ask everyone to mute yourself when you're not speaking to avoid any background noise for other attendees. At the end, watch for an email from WASBO this afternoon with the link to evaluate today's session. And we really look for your feedback to help us plan for future topics and presenters. So please take the time. It's really quick. It will definitely take less than 5 minutes to fill out the evaluation and any other session ideas. So it's my pleasure to announce our first speaker, David Ziegelbauer. David serves the new Holstein School District as the business manager. He earned his Certified School Risk Manager certification in 2021 and is WASBO's 2023 New Business Manager of the Year, as well as a member of the 22-23 Wally Zastro Leadership Academy cohort. David and his district worked to bring the transportation services in-house in 2020 and look forward to sharing their experiences with you. Thank you for joining us, David.
All right, thanks, Rhonda. So I'm going to just start out by prefacing this and saying this is not going to be a presentation saying this is the best thing in the world to do. Every district needs to do it. And it's not going to be a thing saying this is the worst thing in the world. You should never do it. We wish we wouldn't have done it. You're going to have to find what works best for your district. You know, some districts, I think this is something that you certainly could do, and others you may not want to do it. But what I'm going to do today is kind of go through our story, all the things that we've done throughout this journey. We don't know if everything we're doing is right because it's a first time thing. So it's kind of a building the airplane while you're flying it in motion. We've gotten our kids to school every day so far this year. And we've seen a lot of great things come about this, but it has also been challenging at times. So I said I'll just kind of go through our story and then I'll take any questions at the end. So here we go. So all right, so a little icebreaker here to start off with, because when I think about buses, this is what I think about.
Dave, you're not currently sharing.
Everybody. Oops. Sorry. All right. My bad. We good?
Yep, looks great.
All right. So
everybody on? Good, great, grand, wonderful. No yelling on the phone.
all right. So when I think of buses from my childhood, I think of that movie or Miss Frizzle from the Magic School Bus. So so the New Holstein School District, we're located on the east side of Lake Winnebago, in between Appleton and Fond du Lac. Our district covers about 130 square miles. Our September head count was 1,020 students. So for our routes, we run 7 public school routes. There's 2 midday routes in there, and then we also have 1 private school route for a Catholic school that services just that school. There's about 25 students on that bus. We do have another Catholic school that is within the distance of our boundaries to transport to, as well as a Lutheran school. So we'll have routes that range anywhere from 48 to 79 miles. And we also travel in 4 different counties, which, one of the things we learned is you need to know what counties your buses are in when they're traveling, in the event that there's a breakdown and you would need to contact the local authorities, which we've now found will inevitably happen, that you will have a breakdown. So kind of the timeline of how we got here, in April of 2019, this was prior to me starting, but the school district entered into a 3-year contract with New Holstein Transportation. This was a local company that had served the district for as long as I can remember. When I was a kid and went to school in the neighboring district, it was the same company. They were very fair, great service. So entered into that in 2019. In February of 2020, right before COVID hit, we were notified that it was sold to one of the larger contractors in the state. The contractor did honor that remaining, agree to honor that remaining contract. Then we had COVID. Our contract in there did have a 0% clause. We didn't have to pay anything during that time when we were shut down. We did, as a goodwill measure, agree to pay 65%, kind of thinking that would help us, knowing our renewal was coming up with the new company. Then in July of 21, it was prior to the 3rd year, we did have a meeting with the owner of the new company, looking at our initial renewal. We were pretty shocked when we saw what the renewal rates were compared to what we were at. And we kind of joked about buying our own buses at that time, and the owner kind of laughed at us and said, go for it. So as time progressed, we got into January of 22, ourselves, along with 2 neighboring districts, Chilton and Kiel, who were serviced by New Holstein Transportation in the past, released an RFP, kind of hoping that we would be able to get in and get some better rates going in as one. We only had 2 companies bid. One was the existing company, and one was another company from the Milwaukee area who was significantly higher than anything we would have imagined. So throughout this whole process, we were already starting to look at what it would take to buy our own buses, get our own fleet up. And in April of 22, our school board approved the purchase of 15 school buses for us. So one thing I would note is we're only running the 8 regular routes a day. Prior to this year, we were running 11. So that's why the 15 number, when we actually did slim that down a little bit. So why? After running the cost estimates, it became pretty clear that we were going to be able to save a substantial amount of money running our own fleet. There was a couple sticking points in the contract renewal that we just couldn't get over. The automatic CPI increases, with CPI hovering around that 8%, and knowing that that contract was going to build year after year on the previous year's increase, it was something that we weren't quite ready to stomach. The last 3 years, we've been moving some money into Fund 46, and we were fiscally in the right spot to go ahead and make this move. So those were the real decisions as to why we decided to go ahead. So the first things you got to consider if this is something that you're going to want to do is your school board and your community, is this something they're going to be on board with? Because if they're not, you should stop right away. But if your school board is behind it, and our school board was 100% behind it, we've had one of our board members that for years has been wanting the district to buy our own buses. So, we had the school board, we had a good amount of people in the community that were behind it. Now, the other thing you're going to have to look at is there's going to be some false narratives. Okay, there's going to be people out there that they want to see you fail. We had social media posts of people saying you have no business doing this. That's a private company's job. You're a school. we had people saying, oh, in the community, we heard about people saying, well, our taxes are going to go up because they're buying their buses, which, our tax rate along with many other districts is going down this year. There were some of the employees at the previous company who were very against this and very vocal at our board meetings, even though we had all intents of hiring them on to come work for us, but unfortunately they just were not on board with it. And another thing is staff morale. So this takes a lot of time and energy to get off the ground. Our entire summer was spent recruiting drivers, recruiting a transportation director, just a lot that goes into it. And unfortunately, when you're doing that, you're pulling some of your energy, that was in the past spent on other things. So it's how are you going to make sure that your staff is able to, keep that morale high and realize that in the long run, right? The reason you're doing this is to save money for the district that you will then have the resources to use in those other areas. So, you got to look at all those things and say, okay, are we going to be able to get over, these three things here? Okay. So then after that, I don't know the order for this. There's when I was putting this presentation together, this kind of stuff all happens at the same time, but in order to have your own bus company, you have to have buses, right? So when you're looking at buses, there's a lot of variables there, right? Are you particular to one brand? So you have Bluebird, IC, Thomas, there's other buses out there. We did a lot of research. There's pros and cons of all of them. Are you going to look for a new bus? Are you going to look for a used bus? Are you going to mix and match that? Then you get into the fuel. So you can look at diesel, propane, gas, electric. Diesel, it's probably the most common bus that you're going to see out there. There's a lot of technicians available. They're reliable. Propane is going to be a lot greener. They have less problems in the winter. It's perhaps a more stable priced fuel. There are some gasoline buses. We didn't hear a whole lot about those. Electric buses are up and coming. Well, you have, pros of that is that it's certainly very green, but the other thing you're looking at is where are you going to charge these things? If they break, who's going to fix them? And how far along is that technology? And then compressed natural gas. Again, not a real popular one from what we could see. One of the things that I did not know when we were looking at buses is the type of brakes makes a difference. Are you going to get hydraulic or air? And the big difference here is for your licensing is what we found out. Air brakes seem to, from what we've been told, last longer, are cheaper, but they need an extra endorsement on your license. So with the current driver shortages that we're seeing in the state, you're perhaps better off to go with the hydraulic brakes, because then you don't need to have that extra endorsement, and it's a little bit easier to get some of your drivers trained. So when you're looking to take on a fleet of large proportion, you have to figure out how are you going to pay for it. Are you going to purchase the buses outright, or are you going to finance them? So those are certainly both options. And then perhaps the most important thing is when can you get the buses? So we found starting the process when we did, we were kind of shoestringed by when we could get the buses to make sure we would get them, have them up and running by the first day of school of the next year. So looking at all of this, what we ended up going with, before we get there, then the other thing is you got to look at the add-ons for the buses. So just getting a bus isn't quite just enough. You have to have a two-way radio in every bus. And this was actually one of the issues. We were struggling to find a guarantee of getting these by the start of school, but what we were able to find is it's a Motorola, it's a cell-based option. We do have to pay a monthly fee which is unfortunate. But the major pro of these is they're cell-based, so we're not constrained by radius. So if our buses need to run to Green Bay, Sheboygan, Manitowoc, Campbellsport, the radios will work and we'll be able to contact our base. Versus in the past where we just had an antenna radio. Once you got out of a certain radius, they weren't working. Then cameras, we had cameras installed on our buses. We have 4 cameras on the interior. We have a stop sign camera, which is in the one picture right underneath it. So if anybody runs through a red light, the red warning lights, it'll take a picture of that, and the driver can be cited. And then there's also a backup camera on the buses. So we felt cameras were very important on the buses from a driver retention and safety aspect. We want to make sure the kids are being safe, and if they are misbehaving, that we can support our drivers to address that, as well as the safety issue of the stop sign camera, making sure that all drivers are obeying the red warning lights on the buses. And the backup camera, another just a safety and trying to avoid any damage that could be caused. The GPS, all of our buses, we have a GPS unit in it. It's Viafy is the company that we went with it. Actually, this was something that we had on our previous buses that we were already paying for separate of our contract. These units allow us to see every bus where they are. Gives us real-time data if an check engine light comes on. In the office, we can actually see what that code is reading. And the other thing is this allows our parents to be able to see where their child's bus is at. So our 130 square miles, we're covering a lot of country roads, and this time of the year, it's nice for the parents and the children to not have to wait outside if they know that their bus is going to be a little bit. In all transparency, we have had some issues, however, with that part of this with the Viafy software talking with our Skyward student data. So we've had some issues with that, but as far as the other aspect of being able to track our buses and see them, it's been very beneficial. And then the routing software is another add-on that you'd need. So we went with, it's called Lynx. It's based in Wisconsin. It was the software that the previous company was using. And the person that we hired to be our transportation director was a little bit familiar with that. So that's why we decided to stick with that. There's a ton of different softwares for routing out there available. So with that all being said, the buses that we went with is we ended up buying 14 brand new buses. They are 2023 International diesel school buses. So the price breakdown, the buses were $98,850. We bought 2 extended warranties, and that I'll talk about a little bit in our maintenance slide down the road here. The camera system was a pretty hefty investment, and then our radio system. So all in all, these buses came in at $117,000. So we bought 14 of them. So out of the 14, 10 of them we purchased outright using our Fund 46 and some ESSER dollars. We purchased them outright. 4 of the buses we financed. So we will pay for 4 of them over a 5-year period. So once you have your buses or your director, kind of the different positions before you get drivers that we hired on, we hired a director. So as I said, this person came from the other company, was one of the employees that did come over. She is a 1.0 FTE. This is just some of her duties that she's responsible for, but is scheduling, the hiring, the meetings, maintenance records, taking the parent phone calls, routing, dispatching. She is a licensed driver, so she's a sub driver when we need somebody. as well as, maintaining trip sheets for field trips. In addition to her, then we have a coordinator who, this is our high school office manager. So in addition to her office manager duties, she works either before or after school, or mingles some of this in, but she'll also do the dispatching. She helps with the routing, the trip sheets, as well as taking parent phone calls. And if either of those two are unavailable, we have trained some of our other office staff to fill in on the dispatching before or after school, to fill in there. So one of the things to look at when you're talking about dispatching is to know that it's almost an all-day thing. You have buses that are doing 4K routes, so they're going out for those midday routes. You have field trips. If a bus is getting taken somewhere for maintenance, your drivers are radioing in. So just knowing that that's a kind of a all-day thing. Another thing to think about with this is, where is this person going to be located, or these people? Is it going to be in your main office? Are they going to have a separate office where they're going to do this out of? We have our middle school and high school, 2 buildings connected together on one site, but then a little bit across town is our elementary school. So the director actually has a desk in our high school office. So it's nice. I'll say it's nice to have the communication that she's very available. But at times it gets to be a little busy, and it might be better off actually to have that position in a separate location. So that's something we'll look at after the conclusion of the school year. So moving on here, right, so you have buses, so they're going to need maintenance. Okay, so we looked at a mechanic. Are you going to hire on a mechanic, or are you going to hire out that work? So the previous company that we had, they had 2 full-time mechanics servicing 3 districts. So that comes out to about a 0.67 FTE. And after doing the math on what a mechanic would cost, at this point, we determined it was more cost effective to hire out that mechanic work. So we're talking, brakes, oil changes, the regular kind of routine stuff like that. And we partnered with a trucking company here in town who have a mechanic. So that's who we're going to take our buses to, or have been taken for any minor things. As far as warranty work goes, because our buses are all within their first year, and we bought the extended warranty, we take them to, it's Lakeside International. It's located in Sheboygan, so it's about a 30-minute drive for us. So we do have a little human capital if we need to drive the buses there, but it's not a significant distance. And I will tell you, just because they're brand new buses does not mean that they are not going to have issues. We've had quite a few of them in for warranty work. They've been taken care of and fixed and returned, but just know that they're going to break down. So be prepared for that. Now, other things to look at, right? You just have kind of your general stuff, and you got to figure out, is your maintenance staff or your director able to take care of that? So we've had a couple bulbs go out on the buses, right? So do you want to pay somebody to change those, or is that something that somebody in the office is gonna take care of? Wipers, same thing. Do you have wipers on hand for when they got to get replaced? Washer fluid, who's filling that? Is the driver going to fill that? Is a coordinator going to fill that? A custodian, etc. So other things to keep in mind there. Tires, our buses are new, right? So we think we shouldn't need new tires for a while, but that's not to say that we couldn't have a tire blow out or get a cut in it. So we have a Pomps in town here, and they have a pretty extensive network across Wisconsin. So we signed up with them. We got some pricing, and if we have tire issues, that's who we're intending to go with. Just because if we have a basketball game in De Pere, if something happens with the bus, we know that we can call them. We have our pricing, we have our account set up, and we can get that taken care of. Another thing to look at is towing. You're not gonna call just a regular towing company if you need to have a bus towed. So we did have to have one of our brand new buses towed. It had a transmission issue. And there's a company in Chilton, which is about 4 miles away, that has the heavy duty towing and was able to tow our bus over to Sheboygan for that warranty work. Fueling your buses, you got to look at, okay, there's really two options here. You can get a tank on site, or you can fill up at a station. In the past, we did buy our own fuel, and it was stored at the old bus company. But what we decided to go with here is we partnered with a company in town, the local BP, who's been really good to our district, giving us rewards back just for regular members in the community that fill up there. And they give us right now 17 cents off a gallon. And we have it set up on account, so we're getting our federal road taxes taken off as well. What we did is we have a card in every single bus. Every driver has their own PIN. So when they need to fill up, they'll go fill up, they'll record the mileage, they'll use their PIN. And at the end of the month, we can run reports, check gas mileage, fuel mileage on the buses. And kind of, it's a really good tracking tool. So we've been pretty pleased with that so far. If you go with diesel for buses, you got to have the diesel exhaust fluid that the buses need. So our buses have a 16-gallon tank. They run about 3 gallons of DEF for every 100 gallons of diesel. So what we ended up doing for this, you can see in this picture here, is we have a tote, and we have that coming filled. So the station where we fill up our buses at does have the option of paying for it at the pump, but it's about double the price. So it's a little over $4 a gallon versus $2 something a gallon. So it's about once every 2 weeks our buses will come and fill up, and this tank is just held inside of one of our garages here. More considerations, the washing and the cleaning of the buses. So is that something you're going to do, your staff's going to do? Are you going to take them somewhere? Is there a truck wash near you that you can have them done at? So right now we're running into an issue. Well, it's winter. We have been washing ours outside, but it's winter and people don't want to do that. So we're getting some pricing from a company to come in and wash on site. We also have a local charter company who has given us some pricing to take the buses there, so that we're looking at the human capital of driving a bus there, but it may be the option that we go with there. And then also with the diesel, you got to put winter fuel treatment in that to make sure you don't have any gelling up. That's more of a precaution. I think you can use the diesel that you're getting at your gas station, should have some of that treatment in there, but we're going with adding a little extra just to ensure that we don't have a bus gel up and break down. So you got your buses, where are you going to store them at? So on-site or off-site? So you can kind of see the picture here. What we did is we have them on site right now. We extended our high school parking lot this fall. So it's a gravel pad right now down the road. We plan to pave that. Are you going to look at building a bus barn? That's certainly something that we're putting into our long-term capital planning. With the purchase of the buses right now, we didn't build one. So along with adding in that pad for our bus storage, we did at that time trench in electricity, because all these buses in the winter, you need to keep your engines warm. So they're on timers, and they get plugged in now every night. So they're good and ready to start in the morning. We also added security cameras. As you can see, some of the snippets I have over here. One of the big things we've seen a lot of is the Cadillac converters being stolen. So we spent a substantial amount to get security cameras around these buses. to hopefully deter any thieves from trying to steal those. And then will you let drivers take their buses home? We do, with the size of our district. One of our routes where he starts, it makes sense. So I think we have 3 drivers that take them home. It also, it kind of mitigates that risk of not having all your buses in one place if something were to happen to them. So we do allow them to take them home. So I guess probably the most important thing after the buses is getting drivers. So we, as I kind of stated earlier, we did not get all of the drivers from the last company. The previous company, they didn't all want to come over. So we've been recruiting pretty hard, similar to almost every bus company or school in the state, it seems like. So we did, you know, we have a pretty substantial, or I should say aggressive pay rate, but different places that we've gone for our recruiting, we haven't been that successful for school bus drivers. Most bus drivers aren't going to look on weekend. So our local newspaper, Indeed, that one, you know, we got a couple applicants from Indeed. Local parades, when we got our new buses this summer, we put them in the parades. We've held hiring events, social media through our district's Facebook page, we've pushed it. And then current staff members and coaches. Our high school ag teacher has had his license. So that was an easy one. He actually runs a route. His schedule allows him to run an AM and a PM route. He, you know, he's gonna add quite a bit onto his pay this year, and he really enjoys it. You have coaches to run the extracurriculars. That helps. We do allow our coaches to get paid for driving the bus the whole time. So I myself, we started this, I went and got my license, so I kind of help fill in as needed as well. I ran a route this morning. We put a banner on a bus around town, and then referral. We have a referral bonus. So, you know, we've been big on trying to get people, hey, if you know somebody, and some of our drivers have helped bring some people on board. So we'll give them that bonus for that. As far as the driver pay, this was another thing to look at. Are you going to pay them hourly or per route? We pay ours hourly, and then the pay is anywhere for a regular route. They get paid anywhere from $21 to $24 an hour. Our extracurriculars all get paid the same rate at $16 an hour. We have to transport to the private schools. We have been doing for 2 of the private schools, we have been running their field trips for them when they ask us. We don't look to make money on it. We have a rate that covers the driver salary and what we determine for the mileage per mile. You know, so the drivers for all these trips do have to fill out trip sheets, start time, end time, mileage, etc. We do have 2 drivers that are also custodians for us. We've been struggling to fill some of our custodian positions. So they will drive about 4 hours a day and do custodial work for 4 hours a day. So it gets them to that 1.0 FTE. So it helps fill another position there. So, and we do utilize True Time for all of our drivers. So there's multiple different codes. If they're running an extracurricular, what they're punching in for, if they're running a private school, a regular route, if they have a meeting. So our payroll person has done a great job of setting that up and helping that flow. So training, when you're getting drivers or people that want to be drivers, right, you have to look at training. And so what are the requirements? The Class B, CDL, the P endorsement, and the S endorsement, and potentially the air brake endorsement. As I stated earlier, we went with the hydraulic buses, so we didn't need that additional endorsement. One of our drivers that we hired has a great mechanical background, worked for Boeing for a lot of years. And he went through the process to get us registered with the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. And he does our training on site for us. So he did all of the entry-level driver training for me. So I did some classroom theory. I did all the practice parking and the alley docks and all that good stuff in the parking lot. And then we did on the road training and pre-trip, all the things that you need to do. And then after he felt I was ready for it, we partnered with a company in Manitowoc who is an independent third-party tester. So we took a bus over there and I took my test and I got my test and I was the first one to get through it for us. It worked great. And since then we've had another driver go through and get his license as well and has been driving for us. So if it's something you're looking at doing, adding on your own buses, I would highly suggest, going through the process of getting somebody that can get you registered and get training done for you on site to save that money. So just kind of wrapping up here, some miscellaneous things. Things to keep in mind, your drivers all have to have physicals. Every 2 years, if they're going to be crossing the state lines, getting the Fed Med card, coming up with the replacement bus schedule. How long are you going to run your buses for? How long do you plan to before you need to replace it, get a new one? Are you going to have somebody that's going to be in the building that can go and take a bus out if one breaks down? So as I said, we had one bus that had a transmission issue. The driver radioed in. I was able to run one of our spare buses out there safely, have the students on the broke down bus get off that bus onto the other bus, and she was able to continue on with her route, and then we had that towed. Knowing every bus has to get inspected every year, having that taken care of. With more employees comes more employee handbook updates. District policy is going to have to get updated. You're going to need a room or an office for your director and driver. So we have an old classroom that we've turned into kind of our lounge for our drivers. It's where the trainings take place. It's got a fridge and stuff in there for them. And then other things to think about is just kind of your commodities for keeping your buses clean: paper towel, puke powder, brooms, trash cans, window scrapers, etc. If you have any EC students that are going to need to have car seats, you're going to need to get seat belts put in the buses, which is a pretty simple thing. So far this has been successful for us. We've seen great cost savings. We expect those cost savings, to increase as time goes on. We have a lot of the startup costs right now. Our students are on brand new buses. That was one of the other things that with our prior contractor, our buses were pretty old and not as reliable as we would like. So it's nice for the students to be on that. We also find that our drivers, right, it's a good recruiting piece when you can, get a driver and say, hey, we got brand new buses, we have 4 cameras inside of them, heated seats, so that's helped. Also the autonomy, if you need a bus last minute, it's pretty quick and easy to immediately talk to the transportation director and say, hey, do you have a bus driver that can run a bus here? Something came up. So but as I said, no, there certainly are challenges along with having more people in your company. You have more people, right? So right, that's going to be a challenge. Things are going to come up, and that's something to keep in mind there. So with that being said, I don't know how I'm doing on time, 40 minutes. So any questions or anything, Caitlin?
I am watching the chat, none as of yet, but folks, just a reminder, you can raise your hand and I'll call on you to unmute. Or if you'd rather just drop a question in the chat, that is totally fine. Oh, Sean asked for a copy of the slides. He really thought you had great information today. Would you mind emailing those to me?
Sure. You want me to send them to you, Caitlin? Or to
Yeah,
Sean?
and then we'll include those in the post-webinar email that goes
Okay.
out along with the evaluation.
Okay.
Thanks for asking, Sean. Josh asks, how long do the buses last? Will you need to purchase buses on a rotation going forward?
Yeah, so that was kind of what I was saying in the replacement schedule. Looking at buses that we've seen around, some of the previous buses our kids were going on were from 2005. We're looking to keep our buses. We're thinking probably around 7 to 10 years for our replacement schedule. So that's kind of the crystal ball of being new at this that we're still trying to figure out.
Fair. And are you just kind of like building that into your budget to kind of put some money aside for that?
Yep. So our capital improvement plan, we've started putting money in every year to look for that. So
Awesome. Next question. How long are your students on the bus for a route?
So our longest one is about an hour and 20 minutes, which is longer than we want. And hopefully by next year, we'll be able to get another full-time driver to make the 7 routes go to 8. But that's our longest one. It's pretty typical about an hour though.
Awesome. Mr. Barry, do you see a trend here of smaller districts returning to owning and operating their own school buses?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. That's kind of what I was saying at the beginning. I think it's right for some districts. I really do. But with our size, it worked out. I think if you get into, the bigger districts, I wouldn't want to do it. But you get north of 64 in the north part of the state, and everybody's running their own buses up there. There aren't these private companies. So I know we've had other people reach out to us and ask us questions about it. I'll tell you, Random Lake is one that they switched to in-house about, I think, 2 to 3 years ago. And Rachel at Random Lake has been extremely helpful in our process in doing this. So, it definitely can be done, but just know it's a lot of work. You're probably going to have a couple sleepless nights to get it off the ground. Our first day of school was a train wreck. But the second day was 100 times better, and it's gotten better every day since, and that's the goal. So where we are right now, it's definitely heading in the right direction. And we're happy that we went ahead and did this.
I was going to say, what's it like to sleep at night?
Yeah. If it's not one thing, it's another.
Right. I have another question that I have someone hoping you can talk about how and why it's helpful for the transportation director to have a coordinator and a dispatcher to help that director.
Well, so you have buses. Our first bus leaves the yard at about 6 o'clock in the morning. So that's going to be our longest route, right? And then you have at the end of the day, the last bus is probably getting into the yard sometime after 5 o'clock. So trying to have that director be here for that many hours is not an option. It's not fair to them. We wouldn't expect that for her to do that, right? So the coordinator, usually what they'll do is one of them will come in early and take the morning, and one will do the night. So it kind of spaces out that time a little bit. But they need days off too. They have doctor appointments, and then also our director has, she has to drive sometimes, unfortunately. So at that point, that's where we have three other people in the office that will fill in, and we have a schedule. I mean, it's laid out a month in advance of when we know somebody's going to be out, so somebody will cover. But as far as the coordinator and the director, I think it's good to have both, because especially this summer, there was a lot of stuff going on with getting all the routes that you really want two people to take team that. If at this point we have the director out, running routes, you have phone calls coming in, so you need somebody that knows what they're talking about right when they answer the phone, not just an admin assistant who's not connected to the bus area of the district. So and we're trying to definitely share as much with all our admin assistants, so they're becoming familiar with it. But that's why I would say you want to make sure you have all those positions. So
Absolutely. One more question. Can you ballpark the annual savings that you are seeing / projecting to see?
So, and I knew that question was going to come up, and we've been tracking it. There's a lot of initial expenses, just things that we're not expecting, but we know we're not going to have on a regular basis. But when I compare what we paid September of last year and what we paid October of last year, I haven't done November's yet. We've saved about $14,000 a month from the bus company. So that was last year's. Now, knowing that that was the old contractor rate. So what was going to be, we have this all figured out, but what the new contract was going to come in, it would have been even more than that 14,000. That's just looking at what we paid last year. So, independent of this, I can tell you just in general what we're saving on doing it ourselves. We're projecting to spend about $36,000 more in fuel this year than last year, but that has nothing to do with us running our own buses, but we're seeing that expense go up. So luckily, where we're going to save will offset that a little bit. And knowing there was that kind of capital investment, right? So taking that all out of the picture of what the actual buses cost and the radios and all that, just what we're looking to save every month. That answers that.
Yeah, I think you did a great job breaking that down for them. I don't have any other questions in the chat at present. So thank you so much for your time today, Dave. I know this was a lot of time to put this together. We really appreciate it. We know you're busy. And I'm going to kick it back to Rhonda to introduce our next speakers.
Thank you.
Great job, Dave.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. All right, our final speaker of today's transportation tidbits are Andy Phillips and Chrissy Hamiel of Attolles Law SC. Andy and Chrissy have spent their careers assisting local governments, school districts, and businesses with their most challenging legal problems. We appreciate you both taking the time to speak to our group on transportation contracts today.
Thank you. And so I think this is our cue, Chrissy. Are you going to share screen? There we go.
And pair contracts.
Are you going to appear on video as well? Maybe Chrissy's not going to start her camera and take herself off of mute. That would be really awkward.
I was just getting to it, Andy. Had to get the presentation up. Hopefully everyone can see it.
Yep,
Excellent.
It looks great.
Perfect.
Excellent. So do you want to kick us off, Chrissy, or would you like me to do it?
Go ahead, Andy.
Transportation contract basics are something, this is a topic we've talked about actually quite a bit in the past 6 months. It's time for renewal of these transportation contracts toward the end of the school year, but it is never too early to start thinking about the issues that we see in a lot of these transportation contracts. We saw heightened awareness and interest in these contracts, frankly, when the pandemic hit. I don't know if everybody remembers, but school was shut down toward the end of the 2020 school year. And it created a lot of scrambling for a variety of reasons. One of the issues that we saw quite a bit of was, what do we do with our buses and our transportation provider now that we don't have kids that are going to school anymore? And that led to us saying, what does your contract say? And we saw a lot of school district administrators, business officials, and others scratching their heads saying, boy, I never really looked at the contract in that way, so we really don't know what happens. And frankly, a lot of the contract language that we saw wasn't the best. And so as we started unwinding what to do in 2020, we started identifying different issues that, separate and apart from what to do in the midst of a pandemic, what happens in terms of the relationship between transportation provider and school district. And so we thought it would be a good idea to have a basics discussion with many of our clients and many of our friends out in the school community, talking about these contracts in a way so that you understand the terms and so that people can get through and understand from a business perspective what works, what might not work as it relates to these transportation contracts. Why don't we go to the next slide, Chrissy? And so when we look at this contract, this relationship between transportation provider and school district, we first want to provide you with the tools to understand what the contract says, but we're also going to focus on process. And the reason we focus on process is that a contract is a legal document embodying the terms of a legal relationship between school district and transportation provider. The contract defines the relationship, but it is not the only part of the relationship. If we follow a process to create that contract, we are much more likely to get into a good relationship, or what we would consider to be a good relationship with our transportation provider. Our hope, and I think your hope as well, is that we don't find ourselves in the midst of a contract having to call legal counsel about what to do in a particular circumstance. If we have to call a lawyer, that's never a good sign. We like it. Chrissy and I love it when you guys call us, but we also recognize that if the relationship is broken to the point that you got to call legal counsel, that's usually not good. So how do we put ourselves in a position for success as it relates to our relationship with the transportation provider? So we ask these questions on contract review. Do we provide our contracts upfront to the provider and ask the provider to delineate exceptions to the contract or negotiated points? That's a question in the RFP process. Do we rely on the transportation provider's template agreement? Do we involve legal counsel? Do we contact our insurance carrier? In other words, what is your checklist of items going into an RFP and a contract negotiation that you want to make sure that you have established before you ever begin to review the terms of the contracts? Because that, to us, again, from a process standpoint, is critically important. And Chrissy, I know you're on mute, and I know that you have a really difficult time interrupting me, but please interrupt me when I start going like this, because as you know, I'll talk for an hour about this stuff because I love this stuff.
Keep going, Andy. Keep going. You're doing great.
All right, next slide. And I'm pretty sure Mike Berry's going to interrupt me at some point here too and tell me I'm out of time. So what did we learn from COVID-19? What did we learn from the pandemic? Well, first of all, we learned that contract language has meaning. And what I mean by that is that if we look at, as lawyers, the contract as embodying the essential terms of the contractual and legal relationship between district and school district transportation provider, then that language is going to define rights, responsibilities, duties, obligations, liabilities of both parties in that relationship. And so the language that we use in the written contract is incredibly important in terms of defining legal rights and responsibilities. But as I stated earlier, contract language is not the only factor. Typically, I'm not going to say always, but typically, two people who are very happy with each other don't end up suing each other. That's not what happens. And so if we've got happiness on both sides of the contractual equation, that's what we want. We want this contract to work. And so what do we have to do in terms of effort to make sure that that relationship is going to work? Number one, let's have a solid contractual relationship that is not full of vagueness, not full of ambiguity, doesn't leave people scratching their heads wondering what their obligations are. Let's set all that out in the contract. We also have to consider the current environment and landscape. I talked earlier about an RFP process, and I'm sure some of you are saying, well, it'd be great if we had to go to RFP for transportation, but the reality is we got one bus company within our district that can actually do what it is that we need done to get our kids to school. Well, okay, we understand that. And so you may not use an RFP process. So what do you do in that circumstance in terms of, again, positioning yourself for success in that relationship? And then finally, the parties' business relationship. It was much easier for us to negotiate an appropriate outcome with transportation providers as it relates to dealing with the pandemic in those districts where they had a great relationship with the transportation provider. In other words, there was a recognition on both sides that we were going to work through the issue. If it became contentious, if that relationship wasn't good, that just led to protracted negotiations and a very difficult process coming out of COVID-19. So again, how do we position ourselves to make sure that we have a solid business relationship with our transportation providers?
Well, and Andy, one of the things I would add there, and Dave touched upon this during his discussion about why they made the switch to providing district transportation as opposed to going through a contract with a transportation provider, is that relationship. Dave mentioned that, you know, their contract said that during that school closure, district wasn't required to pay their transportation provider, but they did so in good faith. And I think Dave said 65%. Nevertheless, that relationship still broke down. And so that just sort of underscores how important these relationships are that you develop with your transportation providers, and ensuring that those relationships are not one-sided.
Very good points. So what are our themes in negotiation here? What do we tell our clients they ought to be thinking about when they go into negotiating their bus contracts? Number one, the transportation contract is no different than any other contract. It's a legal contract, and every legal contract has offer, acceptance, and consideration as the essential terms. But this is a very expensive contract and a very important contract. And so I think we should pay heightened attention to this particular contract. We often get asked the question, what type of contracts do you as legal counsel want to get involved in reviewing? And the reality is we could say, well, every single contract would be good to forward to us, but then you're going to say, well, wait a second, if I've got a contract for $1,000, by the time you get done reviewing, I'm going to pay more in attorney's fees than I do in that contract. That's entirely true. So our point is, let's deal with the important contracts and put you in a position to deal with the inexpensive contracts on your own. But in this particular situation, given the dollar value associated with the contract and the importance from a public perception standpoint, from a community standpoint, from a parent standpoint, the importance of getting our kids to school on time, on schedule, with regularity, getting them home from school on time, on schedule, with regularity, that means this is a very important contract. So we should pay heightened attention to it. I am going to say this again. I've said it before. A relationship is defined by contract, but refined through effort. And so you don't simply sign the contract and forget about it, but you work on the relationship that you have with the transportation provider. It's critical to connect the dots. Make sure that whatever you discuss with the transportation provider, whether it be in the context of the RFP process, a presentation that the provider made to you or your board or both, whatever, make sure that the contract reflects what it is that you discussed with the transportation provider. So there's no disconnect between, hey, I thought you were going to do X, Y, and Z, and you have the transportation provider coming back and saying, well, the written contract doesn't say X, Y, or Z. And that's really important when we have a contract that extends over a number of years, because we have turnover of personnel that are administering that contract. And so we want to make sure that the contract embodies exactly what was promised and agreed to in the context of the RFP or presentation process. And then the fourth point, and this is a tribute to Kenny Rogers, I guess, you got to know when to hold them and know when to fold them. Understand what terms are critical in terms of the negotiation and do not compromise. At the same time, there are certain terms within the contract that you ought to have flexibility on and ought to give on, so to speak. All right. So understand what terms are critical, know when to hold those, and then understand that there are other not so critical terms where you can fold those. Next slide. The RFP process. important part of the process. If you set this up the right way, you're going to have a really easy negotiation. Identify upfront the checklist of items that you want to see in a proposal that comes to you from a provider so that you have the ability to adequately prepare and adequately compare apples to apples instead of apples to oranges. If you don't have a good checklist of items in the RFP process, you're going to be struggling to figure out what the best proposal is. You can always evaluate cost. That's one thing that you can evaluate apples to apples pretty easily through the process, but there are so many other important terms. Which again, third bullet point, if we include our required contract in the RFP, we know which provider is going to agree to our contract and which one is not, or if there are exceptions to that contract that are going to be insisted upon, that we know what those exceptions are going to be. Because again, if we provide our contract in the RFP process, we are building out our RFP with an eye toward that end contract. Advise bidders, let them know through the RFP process. Hey, you start making representations and promises in responding to this RFP, we're going to hold you to it. I think that's fair. I don't think that's heavy-handed. I think just saying out front, look, whatever you say in the context of a response to the RFP, we're going to hold you to it. That puts all of the bidders on notice of what it is going to be expected of them.
And Andy, this is where we always see a lot of issues on the back end, of course, with transportation contracts, where issues arise with your transportation provider, and you go to look at the contract language to see what the duties and obligations are of each party. And we hear from a district, well, during the RFP process, the contractor provided that they would do X. And we say, well, nowhere is that in this transportation contract that we have. And so you do a little bit of heavy lifting up front on the RFP process. You better position yourself and ensure that all relevant provisions are included in the event that issues come up down the road. You really position yourself nicely by paying attention early to those critical RFP components.
Well, and I wasn't going to get into this, but I want to wow everybody because we're lawyers, Chrissy. So why don't you explain quickly the parole evidence rule?
Parole evidence rule, Andy, you're asking me to go back to my contract 101 days of law school.
It's a fancy way of
But-
saying that if it ain't in the contract, it doesn't exist. And the way to get evidence in, it's called parole evidence. Evidence that isn't part of the written terms of the contract is incredibly painful. Incredibly painful. So as lawyers, we hate it when a client says, but it was in their proposal, it should be in the contract. Well, if it ought to be in the contract, make sure it's in the contract up front. That reduces your exposure down the line. And it avoids Chrissy and I having to go through the complicated mess of trying to introduce parole evidence that there is a material term of the contract that is missing that was intended by the parties to be there and simply is not. So let's avoid that. Again, there are legal mechanisms to do that, but they take a lot of time. And when you hear a lawyer say something's going to take a lot of time, what does that mean? You're going to spend a lot of money on that lawyer. So let's avoid that. All right, here we've got some sample RFP provisions. Responses provided in conjunction with the RFP shall be considered representations of a successful bidder and a material inducement for the district to enter into a contract. You can put that right in your RFP. And that way, if a successful bidder tries to back away from something that they said or presented in the context of the RFP, they will not be able to do so with this language. Next, the district's standard contractual terms and conditions are made a part of this RFP, and bidder shall provide any requested modifications to such terms and conditions in conjunction with the bidder's response. That puts us on a level platform with the successful bidder as to what is going to be contained within the written contract. Both of these things require some upfront work on the part of the district, probably require upfront cost on the part of the district because you're going to want to involve legal counsel. We will tell you that the investment in legal counsel at the RFP stage is far less costly than the investment in legal counsel if something goes bad with a transportation contract, far less costly. And so we're encouraging our clients and others to involve legal counsel at the beginning where it's less costly. What if you don't utilize an RFP process? You may not have options, as I indicated before, then the negotiation process serves as a substitute for RFP. If we've got a sole source provider and that sole source provider has been working with the district for the past 25 years, that's much different than if you've got 7 different providers to choose from. We understand that. And so what you want to do through the contract negotiation process is, again, make sure that all of the essential terms that are really important to the district, again, knowing when to hold them, knowing when to fold them. You want to make sure those are in the contract and be upfront and transparent with the provider. Don't play games. There's no need to play games through the negotiation process. If they're the sole provider, you need them and they need you. So let's figure out a way to get along together that benefits them and benefits you. We have no issue with the transportation provider receiving a fair profit on the business and the work that they're providing for the district. That's not the issue. What we don't want is ambiguities in the contract. What we don't want are hidden costs. What we don't want are surprises. And so we do that. We eliminate those things by having a transparent conversation with the provider as to expectations embodied within the written contract. 4 big questions on a transportation contract, all right? And these are in plain English. And all of these questions should be able to be easily answered when you look at any transportation contract. What is the provider being asked to do? What services are they providing? It's more than simply getting kids to school on a bus. We have to deal with routing. We have to deal with drivers. We have to deal with all sorts of issues. So what is it that we are asking the provider to do? What information or services are we as a district being required to provide in order for the transportation provider to do their work? What's the compensation formula? And assuming everything goes according to Hoyle, everything's awesome, for how long are we married to each other? And is there a renewal clause? So the basics. There are usually very basic provisions contained within a contract, and we wanted to review a couple of those with you today. Term of the contract. We have an example there on when that term is. Take a look at the renewal clause. Who can terminate the contract and under what circumstances? Is the renewal clause automatic? If the renewal clause kicks in, what are the terms of the contract that apply to any renewal term? This becomes incredibly important when we talk about vehicle fuel maintenance specifications and obligations, because oftentimes, I think in most circumstances, we have a fuel surcharge that attaches to these contracts. How is the fuel surcharge calculated? How is it calculated on a renewal term? All of these things are things you need to consider as it relates to the term of the contract here. Anything you wanted to add on that, Chrissy, based on what you've seen?
I mean, I think what I would add, Andy, is one of the things that we see with these contracts now, especially post-COVID, is these contracts aren't necessarily arranged in a nice, neat way where first we have the term and the procedures for renewal, procedures for termination, and then we go into responsibilities, and then it goes into cost and fuel modifications, et cetera. Oftentimes, these various provisions are sort of peppered throughout an agreement, and it can become very confusing as to what is the term, what are the termination provisions, what are the obligations, because they're peppered throughout the agreement. And so really taking a look closely at all the various provisions of a contract to ensure they're all working together is important. I think the other thing I would say too, Andy, is one of the things I noticed working on a lot of pupil issues for the district is there always seems to be issues that arise when it comes to, for example, attendance of students. How do you know what students are on which bus at what time? And when students are absent, how are we accounting for those absences to ensure that you as a district know where students are at all times when they are being transported or when they should be transported? Another point I would make, it's our second to the last bullet point there, is with respect to student discipline. When there are issues involving student behavior on a bus, who is responsible for imposing behavior consequences? Does the contractor have any responsibility when it comes to student discipline? And if so, what is that responsibility? What are the drivers expected to do in those situations? And what, of course, is the involvement of your school administration going to be? On the technology utilization piece, most buses are now equipped or perhaps should be equipped with surveillance cameras that you as a district are going to want access to. Again, in those student discipline situations or in the event of issues with drivers, you want to make sure that you have access to that video footage. So ensuring that your contract takes into account the technology that is utilized within the bus and your ability as a district to access that technology should you need to do so.
Let me make one. I know that we've got a few minutes left, but I want to make sure that this is pointed out. Oftentimes we see in the contract that either party may terminate, otherwise it automatically renews. And if it automatically renews, then the parties will sit down and negotiate the terms associated with the renewal term. That's not a contract. You don't have a renewal term if that's what it says. The reason being is that there are material terms missing from the contract that applies to that renewal term. It's called in the law an agreement to agree. An agreement to agree is not enforceable. All right. So if you want it to renew on the same terms of the contract, put that in there. If you want to add a 3% escalator to the price term, put that in there. If it's important to you to have that certainty on a renewal term, make sure it's there. If that's not important, if you want to reevaluate this contract upon expiration, then just make it expire. And you can always have a provision that says the parties agree to meet and confer in good faith to negotiate the terms of a successor agreement. That's fine. You can put that in there. Then you're legally obligated to meet and confer and negotiate in good faith, but you don't have a vague contract that talks about what does this renewal term mean. I just want to make sure that point is made.
Good point.
One size fits all, or does it? I know, and Chrissy knows, that school districts talk to one another and that school districts may have an inclination to say to a neighboring district, send us your transportation contract because we want to use that as our template. Avoid the use of forms and templates, because what we have seen is that there are different relationships with transportation providers, district to district to district. So what may be a priority in one district is not a priority in another district. Okay, so again, going back to the example where you may have a district where you have 7 different transportation providers who are capable of bidding on a transportation contract with a district, and in the neighboring district, there may be only one provider, sole source, who can provide the transportation services. That's an entirely different negotiation process and an entirely different contract. So avoid the natural inclination to simply borrow from other districts and use a template for a transportation contract. That said, I think there are certain terms within a contract that would apply statewide to all districts. But again, avoid the urge or the desire to simply use a template from another district, because needs are going to vary district to district to district. Do we really need the legalese? Well, we think it's important. What we have learned over the last 2.5 years is that it's incredibly important. I mean, hypothetically speaking, I know this would never happen. What happens if the governor closes schools for a 2-month period? Did we ever anticipate that? Isn't that a force majeure event? And all of you are probably sitting here saying, yeah, we see force majeure clauses all the time in contracts, but we really don't understand what they mean. Well, that's the clause that kicks in if we have a statewide school shutdown for a 2-month period. That's an act of God, so to speak, that is going to potentially excuse performance under the contract. Well, what happens in that circumstance? The legalese fills in those blanks. What's our protocol if a student's injured on a bus? What happens if we have skyrocketing inflation and skyrocketing fuel prices, or for that matter, deflation, and fuel prices go way down? What happens in that circumstance? How do we terminate the contract? And what notices are required? We know that the transportation provider is not doing its job. So what do we have to do to make sure that we hold the transportation provider accountable for what the contract says? What's the process for changing routes and buses in the event our schedule is modified? What happens if the transportation provider simply doesn't show up on the first day of school? And that sounds absurd, but we had that situation right here in Metro Milwaukee with one of our clients. Transportation provider simply said, we got a shortage of drivers. We can't provide any transportation services. It showed up on the front page of the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, And I will tell you that you don't want your district on the front page for that reason. That's not a good reason to be on the front page. So what happens if that happens? So our takeaways and call to action, all right? Good contractual relationship is a full and transparent allocation of responsibilities in exchange for a fair return on effort. Understand that. Template language may be a starting point. Reviewing the language with the counterparty and discussing the ramifications of that language is going to assist in the negotiation process. Again, that's transparency in expectations. Utilizing a process to work through these business terms is significantly going to reduce the legal spend. Bad for us, but really good for you. Other thoughts, Chrissy?
My other thoughts, Andy, just to kind of wrap things up, and then we can open the floor to questions, are one of the things that we saw coming out of COVID is just how critical the contract language is in these transportation contracts, and certainly in the environment that we are in now, where driver shortages are running rampant. Costs are increasing for people transportation. It's more important than ever to ensure that we are dusting off these contract provisions and tightening up the relationship that we have with these providers moving forward. And so if renewal is on the horizon and we are looking at renewal come July 1st, especially, but even if you might be in year 2 of a 5-year contract, it's never too early to start to take a look at what you want your relationship with your provider to look like going forward and start that process.
Awesome. So now the floor is open to questions unless everybody is a contract expert to this point, in which case I'm going to pat myself on the back and pat Chrissy on the back and say, wow, are we good?
Well, you are good. You're ending right on time, which is not your norm, Andy, but
Thanks,
we'll
Caitlin.
take it.
Thanks. I like that. Thanks.
I say that with love. Mike, I see that you just popped off of mute. Did you have something for Andy and Chrissy?
I wish that that these contracts, I was in a district where we hadn't really looked at the contract in years. So I'm hoping that coming out of the COVID school closing trauma, that everybody takes your advice, Chrissy and Andy, and gets their contracts up to speed and gets rid of all that ambiguity. Yeah, because there are a lot of different reasons that schools can be closed for multiple days. So
No doubt about it. I think that's right, Mike. I think that's a really good point, is that there are a variety of reasons that schools are closed. And we've seen a lot of negotiations recently revolve around the guaranteed minimum of days. And so 175, 176, what makes sense in one district may not make sense in another. Districts here in Metro Milwaukee, where Chrissy and I are located, are different than districts in Hayward. Hayward happens to be a client of ours too, but I think they get a lot more snow than we get here, if I remember right. So there may be closure issues there that don't really happen here. Good point.
Yeah.
Bob asks a great question. Safe to assume that length of contract negotiations is largely determined by how well the RFP is written. In other words, how well our particular district formulates our expectations and non-negotiables. Absolutely. Excellent takeaway, Bob, is that if you put in the work up front, that's going to reduce the amount of negotiations that happen on the back end.
I think one of the things I'm sorry, Caitlin. One of the things that I would add to the question on the length, the length of contract negotiations is that, you're absolutely right. You can reduce that length of the negotiations if you have a really well-written RFP. For those who are not going to RFP, again, perhaps because they're sole provider, or you are fairly satisfied with your current provider and you just are seeking out what the new terms of renewal look like, starting that process early, again, is certainly going to help minimize the length of the overall process on the back end, because you're going to get agreement on critical provisions, those provisions that we know we need to pay particular attention to, and then other provisions that certainly they're important, but they're not going to involve a lot of back and forth between the parties.
Yeah, it's going to be a tough negotiating environment, I would assume, for school district business officials if they are directly negotiating in this year. Hopefully not, but I'm sure that the bus companies, it's a tough negotiation to begin with, because in many school districts there's not a lot of competition. You would not want to go out with a hard bid situation, because you might not get any. You might not get that second, third, or fourth bid, and the bus companies know that better than we do. They understand their own market, and so they know when they've got the leverage. And then, of course, you get all these inflationary factors that are pushing on the margins for the bus company, and they're going to, of course, be crying to the school districts that they need 7.5%, 8.5%, 9% raises this year in their rates, so they can pass that on to their bus drivers. And after all, it's so super important to keep the bus drivers, and we don't have enough of them. So school district business managers better be prepared. And one way to deal with that is to deal with it, right? Start early so you don't get jammed doing this in May or June. I think the bus companies also know that for the business managers, changing contract, changing carriers is tough. It's like, is the squeeze worth the juice on that? Again, the way to combat that is to prepare aggressively for those discussions, have all your arguments lined up, and start early. But even with those efforts, it's still going to be kind of a sticky conversation in these, given these factors that surround the negotiation.
No, I agree, Mike. Understand too. I mean, the labor market's cyclical. It's really tough to find drivers now compared to 2009. 2009, it wasn't very difficult to find drivers at all. Right. And so what we have found is working with our clients is that it's an opportunity to get creative on some of the retention systems, some of the hiring systems. In other words, if the transportation provider says, hey, district, can you share with us the cost of a retention system where we're going to pay a bonus of X number of dollars for every driver that stays with us a year or longer? Absolutely have that discussion, because the turnover associated with the drivers, the uncertainty, the scheduling difficulties and challenges, that's going to cost you a heck of a lot more than participating in a retention bonus program. So get creative and have those discussions.
Yeah, and Andy, that's something that Dave talked about in his presentation earlier, with some of the things that they were doing to get creative to try to attract drivers for the transportation that they were going to provide. So in terms of the creativity there, Dave kind of has you covered as far as a few ideas to try out. So if that, obviously it's an issue for all districts right now with drivers, but think about some of those points that Dave mentioned with the sign-on bonuses and things of that nature that maybe are going to help in the overall recruitment efforts with the contractor.
We did have one question come through the chat. Do you have a recommendation for length of contract in number of years?
Depends on the circumstances. It depends on the price term and other terms. If you want to lock price term and other terms, you think it's favorable, long-term budget-wise, it provides certainty, then absolutely you want a longer-term contract. We have a challenge right now with labor market. And so the challenge with labor market would tell me, at least, that we ought to be looking at shorter term contract, because hopefully the problem isn't going to persist for a long period of time. And so in that circumstance, you might want to do a shorter term. So it really kind of depends upon what you're able to negotiate with the other terms.
Yeah, and to piggyback off that, Andy, one of the things that I think as we are seeing from contractors is the inclusion of a 10-year term, with the increase in each year of costs being tied to CPI. And we all know what CPI looks like right now, where that's incredibly dangerous, I would think, for most districts to be looking at that long of a term, especially with it being tied to CPI in the current economic climate we are in. And so, as far as recommended term, I think it's difficult to give a bright line rule as far as exact number. But Andy, I would wholeheartedly agree. I think in terms of where we're at right now, shorter terms are likely going to be more beneficial with costs.
Nobody wanted CPI a year and a half ago. What happened?
Right. For most business officials, the bus contract is an exercise in risk management, right? You want to just make sure that the critical system is there and that it's working. So that trade-off between cost versus just sort of operational consistency is a tough one, right? I was used to having contracts that ran 4 years that had an automatic renewal unless we intervened and said we're not going to do the automatic renewal. And in some cases we let the contract run down, but in my situation, I was favoring consistency and stability and was willing to trade a little bit of price to get that. And of course, the carriers are leasing almost this entire fleet, right? And so when they go to the bank to get a loan to, to lease their buses, the first thing the bank's going to say is, well, how long is your contract with your major school district or two? And if the answer is a year, the bank might be like, yeah, well, we're not loaning you any money. So there's a whole series of competing interests there that you have to kind of weigh, right, between price and operational stability. So that's why there is no right answer, as Chrissy said.
Does anybody else have questions for Andy and Chrissy before we wrap up for the day?
Okay, hearing none, you can interrupt me, Caitlin, if one pops up. And no, you can't use this time to ask Chrissy and Andy general labor and school district operations questions. No free legal advice today. It doesn't work that way. You have to call them on your own. I wanted to thank Rhonda Page from Sun Prairie for being sort of the overall coordinator of these webinars. I'm really enjoying them. I want to thank David for his presentation earlier on, bringing school bus operations back in-house. That was fascinating up in New Holstein. Chrissy and Andy are regular presenters at all WASBO events. We always enjoy that. And I'm going to take a stab at saying this properly. Attolles.
Well done, Mike.
All right,
well
I'm getting there. Attolles is the law firm. And our next webinar is February 15th. And 2 of those, I'm just going to call these these are like a stone in your shoe type of topics. The first is parent contracts, and the second is administration of the McKinney-Vento rules for transportation of students who qualify as homeless. So that again is February 15th. Go ahead and put it on your calendars. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Rhonda and see if there's anything else. If not, we'll wrap it up.
I think you've covered everything. You just took my script. No, I think we're good. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we hope to see you at our next webinar.
Yes, thank you. Have a happy holidays. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.